Welcome to everybody joining us. We will give it another minute or two to allow everybody to join, and then we will get started. A very warm welcome to everybody today. I'd like to introduce the third session of the WHO and Religions for Peace Global Conference on Strengthening National Responses to Health Emergencies. It is our great pleasure today to be here with you again. This is the third session. We had 2 sessions yesterday. We have the third and fourth session today, and these 4 sessions make up the spiritual care during times of crisis track of the global conference. Today, we will be exploring innovations in delivering spiritual and mental health care during the pandemic. We have a wonderful group of panelists today that I will let my moderator present shortly. But in the meantime, I would just like to give a few housekeeping rules. We have an hour for this webinar. It is being simultaneously interpreted into French, Spanish, and Arabic, so please do feel free to listen in on those channels if you'd like to. We are going to try to have some time for some Q&A towards the end, so please, if you have a question for our panelists, please do put it in the Q&A on Zoom. And as always, if there are any slides, we will be happy to share them afterwards. So without further ado, I'd really like to hand over to our co-host, Deepika Singh from Religions for Peace, for her opening comments. Deepika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. But before we begin, as usual, let us please observe a moment of silence to remember all those who lost their lives due to COVID-19. A moment of silence, please. Thank you so much. First of all, on behalf of Religions for Peace, I join Sarah in welcoming you all to this third session, as Sarah said, of spiritual care during times of crisis within our global conference on strengthening national responses to health emergency, which we're very honored to be co-hosting with WHO. You know, COVID crisis has truly highlighted the critical importance of spiritual and mental care, which, as important as it is, usually sort of takes a backseat to other needs. Religion and spirituality, as we all know, can be great sources of solace, enabling people to cope, to heal, and to recover, and in this way play a very critical role in mental health. We have witnessed that this in various instances, context and situation, even during this current pandemic. For example, I can think, supported by the multi-religious humanitarian fund that Religions of Peace established last year, leaders from diverse religious and faith communities worked together to ensure that they were able to set up systems, to deliver religious rites and rituals, spiritual and psychosocial support, while still keeping all the safety and precautionary measures required. So we had teenagers feeling lonely and isolated, kept company, while online platforms, survivors of domestic violence were counseled using mobile apps, and the old and homebound were provided with care and compassion through regular virtual visits. Prayer services were aired online on radios and TVs, in this way sort of giving hope, solidarity, and comfort to millions. So religious leaders and institutions and communities had to adapt and change and be very creative and innovative to meet this increasing, what we've seen, spiritual and mental health needs. And we're truly honored to have experts here with us today to share their insights, knowledge, and experience of how this is being done. So without further ado, I hand it over to our moderator of this session, Ms. Haley Futu. Haley, over to you.
Thank you, Deepaka. Yes, it's time to get creative, definitely. So today we're going to be exploring some of the creative ways different faith communities have shifted spiritual care online, and what have been some of the lessons learned, as well as some of the challenges using this new method of communication. Well, it's not new, but we've increased its usage dramatically during this time. So some of the questions we're going to be exploring today are, what has been lost in the online shift, and what are some of the new opportunities that have appeared, and how have religious leaders and communities responded to increase their response to the mental health issues of loneliness, suicidal thoughts, how the elderly have been very isolated, which has led to lessening of cognitive function, etc. And also, what creative actions have we been taking as congregations around the world of different faiths and new and different ways during this pandemic, and how have we both addressed the spiritual needs as well as the pastoral care and the mental health needs of our community, both among our worshipers, but also amongst the larger community that is sometimes for the first time realizing they need to draw on spiritual support and looking for those sources. So we're very excited to welcome our first speaker today, Professor Cheryl Giles. She's joining us from Francis Greenwood, Peabody, and she's a senior lecturer on pastoral care and counseling from the Harvard Divinity School in the USA. So dear Professor Cheryl, we'd like to ask you, and I apologize, this is a very long question, so you will feel free to share what comes to you. But what we'd like to ask you to speak to is just tell us a little bit about your work at the intersection of spiritual and mental health care, and how you've explored new avenues during the COVID pandemic. And because we know there's a lot of new triggers that have come up for people during this time, with previous trauma, with anxiety, with depression, and isolation. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. I'm going to hand it over to you, Professor Giles.
Great. Thank you, Haley. The pandemic arrived in the US, in the United States, when the country was deeply polarized and engulfed in acts of hatred, violence, and racism. The resistance by the president at that time to respond to the pandemic stymied our ability to take swift action and increase the spread of the virus. And that's kind of the background of the crises. At this point, more than 730,000 people have died from the coronavirus and pandemic. The question for me is, how do chaplains and other caregivers take care of their own spiritual, emotional, physical well-being in the midst of caring for others who are experiencing pain, anguish, and suffering? Many chaplains and caregivers are now dealing with burnout. We are in the midst of a spiritual and mental health crisis, and our resources are strained, and we're running out of time. To meet the demands of this crisis is a real challenge, and it really requires that we shift the culture and practice of policies in the United States across this country. My own context is as a professor at Harvard Divinity School, which is a multi-religious divinity school that prepares students to be scholars, ordained ministers, chaplains, hospital chaplains, prison chaplains, chaplains on campuses, and teachers in independent schools that want to teach religion. I've been teaching pastoral care and counseling and trauma and resilience to students in other courses, death and dying, for about 25 years at this point at the Divinity School, with a focus on caregiving and resilience for caregivers. So this is one of my major interests and something that I've been thinking about studying and trying to figure out how to teach better. I just want to give you a quick snapshot. For most of the pandemic, I was on sabbatical. I only had a brief period where I was teaching online, teaching students online. That experience was pretty challenging. Most of my students would show up and appeared very dull during the conversation while I was trying to engage them in the books that we were reading and the material and other kinds of resources. And we had a lot of assistance from the Divinity School from other sources to kind of help us think creatively about how to manage the classroom. But as somebody who is trained as a psychologist, one of the things that came to my mind immediately is for us to really just take time and pause and to allow people to really kind of be wherever they were. And I found in a 2-hour or 2.5-hour class, I found that this was, even by taking 20 minutes to a half hour, which seemed to be, it was experimental at the beginning, but throughout the semester, I really needed to do this because students who were really exhausted, had difficulty concentrating, really high anxiety, and I imagine some depression. So most of you know that this particular generation, the millennials and Generation Z, are really highly competitive, those in the United States anyway. And so there's always lots of anxiety in the background. As I moved on into a year-long sabbatical for most of the pandemic, I became involved in a project developed by the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, which was founded by Wendy Kodge and Trace Haythorne and some other people at Brandeis. And one of the things that they looked at was how can the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab support chaplains of color. And they did a survey and found out there were very few resources for that particular group. One of the reasons why I think they settled on this particular group is that the healthcare disparities and economic disparities and social disparities for people of color, Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx folks are really, really heightened over the past 4 years under President Trump. And these racial disparities have really increased the spiritual crisis that people experience and mental health challenges. So through this Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, they began to think about how can they get creative and do this. And one of the things that they developed was something called conversation circles. And so they scoured spiritual care providers across the country and asked who are some of the providers of color and other people, caregivers that are working on this topic. And they developed this network. I became part of this network along with a bunch of other people. And they developed a series of conversation circles in which 8 to 10 people, 8 to 10, chaplains of color were involved in a conversation circle. And we met for an hour and a half every other week for about 2 months. And this project went for about 6 months, and it was obviously seed money was needed, and it was funded by one of their partners. Let me just say that this one project, which is in some ways seems simple, had some, was difficult in terms of organizing and finding how to connect with the right people. But the depth of the gratitude from the chaplains of color that were involved in this, and they were of different religions: Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Unitarian Universalists, non-theists, all gathered. Most of them had been trained at divinity schools across the country in the US. They were gay, lesbian, transgender, heterosexual, bisexual, and questioning. And the thing that was profoundly clear was that they really wanted to connect. And as we started to talk to them, we worked in pairs. It was clear that they really had a heavy burden trying to be caregivers to people in the hospital, the people that they saw, but their hearts were heavy about their own work that they were doing. And they were worried about burnout while they were trying to manage their own sort of spiritual struggles around what they were doing, professional struggles around, is this the right place? Should I be doing this? And the emotional and mental drain from really trying to be compassionate toward others and learn how to have compassion for oneself. That was probably the most difficult thing for them. And for most of us is having self-compassion. The experience itself was just, it was an incredible experience for me. It's one that I'll never forget. It felt very, we were part of these groups, and it was just I just felt much gratitude for having a coworker to work with, planning each session. And the response that we received from people that participated in these groups was just extraordinary. One of the highlights for me was that in that hour and a half time, I worried that might be difficult for them to connect over Zoom. They learned to connect over Zoom. We created a kind of container that obviously in conversations around confidentiality, and kind of did the work of trying to make it a safe space, acknowledging that spaces are only so as safe as they can be. But the trust and the ability to share with each other and offer help to each other in terms of suggesting other resources was incredibly powerful.
It sounds very amazing. Absolutely.
So that's something that I'd be happy to talk about further, and that's a good place for me to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Just something that really stood out to me about what you just said was that we need to start with self-compassion in order to truly have compassion for others, and to monitor how compassionate we are on ourselves so we don't burn out, so we can maintain that resilience needed to serve others. And the other thing that I thought was quite key that we can all take away from this is that when you said that these conversation circles started with just 8 to 10 participants, that's a really key number, because when you have these huge things, it's hard to really engage and really serve one another if not everybody has a chance to talk. So when you have 60 people in a lecture style, they can engage. So that small group number is also less overwhelming, which shows us that we all can gather a few people together and offer those types of services.
If I could just add one quick question, one comment. We must have had 12 groups running at the same time with different providers, but there were only 8 to 10 people in each group. So we had, quite a few people going through the process with different providers, for about 6 months.
Thank you. I think we can all learn a lot from that and perhaps duplicate it around the world. Thank you so much, Professor. Our next speaker is Dr. Mohammed Abo-Hilal. Dr. Mohammed is from Syria. He's the founder of Syria Bright Future organization, and they've been doing some really great work there that we can learn from as well. So please, Doctor, please tell us a little bit about the situation that you're working in and some of the crises and conflicts that you've been dealing with, and also how you are bringing in support in the interdenominational space so that it's, spreading those resources across different, perhaps spiritual practices, because obviously people live side by side with different spiritual practices, and how people can learn to cope together. Over to you. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Shelley. I will not be delivering good news, but I will keep my smiling all the session as recommended. Okay, so I'm talking about Syria, and this is the map, and we focus on Northwest Syria, the green area on the map. Next. Next. In a study done jointly by Islamic Relief Worldwide and our organization, Syria Bright Future, we made an interviews with 46 Muslim Syrian women who have been traumatized during the war in Syria or after the displacement. 78% of them expressed that faith, religion, and spiritual practices have had positive effects on their psychological well-being and helped them overcome psychological effects of traumas. However, in Northwest Syria, there's no such things like spiritual care or faith-based approaches that are provided to the clients in a systematic, agreed upon ways. although there is very low risk, if any, of proselytism, as in more than 95% of cases, the mental health professionals and the clients share the same cultural, religious, and even sectarian backgrounds. UN agency, NGOs, local NGOs, and even local mental health professionals have almost no engagement with faith-based organization, faith leaders, or traditional healers. This unfortunately prevents people from getting their rights in receiving a care that is adapted to their culture, including their faith and spiritual beliefs. And it also does not adhere to IASC MHPS's guidelines, which, for example, states in Action Sheet 5.3, facilitate conditions for appropriate communal, cultural, spiritual, and religious healing practices. Next. So why is that? Actually, we got some insight from another study that we did. So we did a survey and we got 181 respondents from humanitarian workers in MHPSS, mental health and psychosocial support, and protection sector have answered this survey. Okay, next. So from them, 44% said they thought or thinking about including spiritual and religious activities in their projects. Next. And 38% said they included religious and spiritual activities, even though some were not included in the original proposal. Now, the more striking result was, out of 69 persons who said they implemented, only 39% reported these activities to their donors, which means 61% of them, for a reason or another, has concealed these activities. Next. When we ask them about how do you think about some statements, only 22% of them think that inclusion of religious or spiritual activities in MHPSS projects contradict with the humanitarian work principles. Next. And almost the same, only 24% think that the lack of community acceptance could be a main obstacle to including religious or spiritual activities in the projects. However, 42% think that inclusion of religious or spiritual activities in MHPSS projects may cause problems because religious activity, for example, may be seen linked to terrorism. And in an area where ISIS are presented, you can think how the humanitarian workers will be fearing to include such activity in this area. 61% think that the inclusion of religious or spiritual activities in MHPSS projects might not be liked by donors, and thus support might be less. And maybe this is the same percentage of people who concealed the activity. So this could give us an explanation. And 73% think that one of the main obstacles to inclusion of religious or spiritual activity in MHPSS is lack of qualified staff to carry out such activity professionally. And the last slide will show us that 80% think that one of the main obstacles is the lack of theoretical framework guiding the inclusion of such activities. In summary, again, next. In summary, in Northwest Syria, there's almost no formal spiritual care provided, no inclusion of faith and spiritual components in the mainstream MHPSS activities, no effective engagement of faith. I forgot to smile, so I smiled. No effective engagement of faith leaders, no guidelines, TORs, SOBs, curriculums or training about engaging faith in MHPSS projects, no indicators in M&E plans about engaging faith in MHPSS projects. Next. So our recommendations, actually there's a lot of recommendations, suggestions. However, if no engagement, no training, no guidelines, and no buy-in from humanitarian actors in the first place to include and such activity, we cannot ask but for rights in applying the minimum standards for MHPSS guidelines. What we do, the next and last slide, what we have done, actually, we tried some ideas from our side. We have trained more than 150 Muslim faith leaders on basic of mental health and psychosocial support. And we found that faith leaders are more willing to learn mental health than the mental health professional to include faith activity. We started to do research by local researchers, and we included big part of the research about the role of faith, religion, spiritual practices, faith-based organization, and faith leaders. And the last but not least, advocating for the importance of including faith in MHPSS by participating in any opportunities like this great opportunity in this webinar. Thank you very much. And this before 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. You know, there wasn't a lot to smile about in those statistics. So I'm happy that you still kept our spirits high. And I think in the end, when you talked about the training of faith leaders in mental health counseling and assistance is quite key. I know the Muslim community here in South Africa, the Christian, the Baha'i, the Hindu communities, we're all also trying to get more of our congregants to become lay counselors. So I think that is going to be a definite key to us finding a way forward. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed.
Thank you.
All right, our next speaker is Dr. Swami Tyagananda. He is a Hindu monk from the Ramakrishna order. I hope I said that right. He's a Hindu chaplain at the Harvard University of the USA. And I just wanted to take a second to just explain, you know, we have this tendency to think of chaplain as Christian-based, but a chaplain is any spiritual support person. So it's nice to see Hindu chaplain. We're all reprogramming ourselves and thinking a little more broadly. So dear Swami, can you tell us a little bit about your work and the spiritual shifts that you're taking in spiritual care online, and what have been some of the innovations that you've made and have been exploring? And what do you think has been gained and lost in the process? We look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Swami.
Thank you. Thank you, Haley. It's an honor to be invited to speak at this conference organized by WHO and Religions for Peace, two premier organizations that I greatly respect and admire. When I received the invitation, I was very pleasantly surprised to find spiritual healthcare included alongside mental healthcare in the theme for this panel. It's very timely, I feel, that the need for spiritual well-being has been recognized along with physical and mental well-being, especially at present time when we are grappling with the effects of the pandemic. The devastating effect of the pandemic on the physical health, of course, needs no reiteration. The daily headlines in papers continue to give statistics of the new infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. What lies behind the staggering numbers is not only the physical pain and suffering, but also enormous stress, anxiety, worry, obviously for one who is infected, but also for the whole family. The consequences, as we all know too well by this time, are not limited to only health. They also affect the economic situation of the family and ultimately of society due to job losses and closing down of businesses. Now, spiritual care cannot be separated from physical and mental care, since all of them are interconnected in various ways. Nevertheless, spiritual care does need to be distinguished from the other forms. When the well-being of the body and the mind is threatened in a drastic manner, something deeper in our personality is shaken, and we begin to ask the kind of questions we may have never asked before. Questions regarding the meaning and purpose of life, or regarding birth and death and afterlife, or our existence itself, who we really are and where we are heading. Exploring and finding answers to these questions, individually or collectively, I believe is what spiritual care entails. Religious places of worship offer an opportunity for this kind of exploration. The pandemic forced the closure of most religious services, and such places then had to scramble to find other ways of providing spiritual care. To give one example, the Ramakrishna order, with its headquarters in Belur Math in India and centers all over the world, not only provided food packets to millions affected by the lockdowns, but also continued their religious programs via streaming services. The option to participate in worship, at least virtually, is better than having no option at all. Many places of worship everywhere, representing different faiths, have also done this. At the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society in Boston, where I live and work, we continue to stream our weekly lectures and classes, and even more importantly, meeting remotely anyone who sought a chance to discuss their spiritual needs or requested help to mitigate their stress. Doing all these things exclusively online felt a little bit awkward in the beginning, but such is the power of human resilience that soon everyone got used to this new way of communicating, praying, and worshiping. The pandemic has led to mixed results from a spiritual perspective. On the positive side, I found a lot more people eager to seek answers to questions dealing with the meaning and purpose of life. Also, because the programs were online, those from distant places, even from other countries and continents, are able to tune in and participate in discussions that are being held perhaps hundreds or thousands of miles away. On the negative side, not used to the forced solitude at home, many continue to find it unbearable to not be able to visit their place of worship, the temple, the church, the mosque, or wherever they worship, in order to pray, worship, and meditate. Also, a lot that was meaningful to people is now no longer available, and many are still struggling to cope with that loss. Such is the experience shared in common by people across religious, cultural, and national boundaries. This mixed response is probably best captured in a program that is organized at Harvard next week. It's titled Lost and Found. We're inviting everyone in the community to come in person or virtually and spend time reflecting on what they have lost and what they have gained in this pandemic. The real and virtual boards placed throughout the campus are already getting filled up with the reflections of students, staff, and faculty. These kinds of activities are already proving to be spiritually healing. Luckily for us in Boston, we had enough resources to carry our spiritual service programs to an online streaming platform. I was therefore able to continue being in touch with the congregation via phone, via email, via video conferencing. But there are many places and many service providers in the different parts of the world who may not have all such resources. The recognition by WHO, the vital role spiritual health plays alongside physical and mental health, fills my heart with hope for the future. With the enormous resources and influence that WHO has, it may be possible now to help spiritual caregivers continue serving and helping people in the future, especially when we are struck by challenges such as the present pandemic. Going forward, perhaps it may be necessary to define more clearly the role of spiritual health and its relation to physical and mental health. Taken together, all three will lead to a more holistic approach to health and well-being. I dream of a time when people everywhere remain healthy, and I hope and pray that whenever needed, physical, mental, and spiritual care is available to everyone easily. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Swami. We definitely share that prayer with you. In South Africa here, we struggle with access to internet in many of our communities. And so when you were talking about some of the things that are lost, you know, sometimes we have those issues here. But this concept of lost and found, what a wonderful exercise to do. It can be done with families, it can be done with university students, like you said, on the boards, it can be a session online. So maybe that's a challenge for all of us to try and figure out maybe a group of 8 to 10 that we could offer that very lay counseling method of just sharing to process and heal. Thank you so much, Swami. Our last speaker today is Dr. Renz Argao. He's the president and CEO of Argo Health Incorporated. He's a moderator from Asia and the Pacific Interfaith Youth Network, coordinator, and he's also part of the Religions for Peace International Youth Committee from the Philippines. So we're so happy to have you with us, and we really look forward to hearing your thoughts. A question just to kind of guide us along would be, can you tell us a little bit about your work with religious leaders and faith communities and the Ministry of Health, and some of those intersections that you're coming across in your work of psychosocial and spiritual care? We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for that. And good evening from the Philippines, or good morning or good afternoon to wherever you may be. To answer that question, allow me first to go briefly back to about a decade ago, since the activities and projects that we had back then were the basis of the many actions that we took to support both spiritual and psychosocial well-being of individuals, families, and communities that have been affected by crisis. Our interfaith work focused on peace building initially through healing of trauma from conflict and crisis. This was in the southern part of the Philippines, in Mindanao, wherein the conflict initially something which was between local communities eventually evolved into a conflict between Muslims and Christians, and eventually between the government and rebels. So the project focused then on trauma healing, and we called it Counseling for Peace. And our partners included Religions for Peace, several faith-based organizations, religious leaders, and religious communities, the Philippine government through our ministries or departments, as we call them, of social welfare and development, health, and interior and local government. We also had several private corporations, NGOs, and even diplomatic missions that are stationed in the Philippines as our partners. And uniquely, we even had the Philippine Army as our partner in one of our projects. And the model that was done, that we used, was done in three phases. One was crisis response, followed by psychosocial rehabilitation and reintegration. And the third was community empowerment. So in crisis response, we provided mental health and psychosocial support services to the survivors of the armed conflict in Mindanao. So here we were able to benefit from the influence of religious leaders who helped us in organizing the communities affected by the conflict. We also conducted some of these programs within or in the premises of places of worships, such as churches and mosques. And since the program also included religious leaders, we have integrated spiritual activities in the program. And here we highlighted the important value of spirituality in their psychosocial recovery. On my own firsthand experience, which actually struck me because there was this part wherein the survivors were actively engaged in the religious services. I asked one of them because he lost family members, he lost their homes and livelihoods. So I asked them, why is it that you still believe in God despite of all the many tragedies that you have been? And the response in Filipino was that it's already difficult to cope with this crisis. Now that I have belief in God, I don't know what will happen to me if I don't believe in God. So that struck me as really the very powerful impact of our spirituality in terms of our recovery. And then the second phase of that, which is psychosocial rehabilitation, we conducted psychotherapy sessions with survivors, especially those who had specialized needs. We started conducting family-based activities to help develop coping within the home. And in the reintegration part, we did this through community-based projects that include recreational activities, sports activities, religious gatherings and services, and even community meetings with the local government. And in the third phase, which is community empowerment, we conducted trainings on psychosocial support for religious leaders, religious communities, women leaders, teachers, and even community volunteers. And then this led eventually to establishment of a community crisis response team, which is in partnership with our local religious leaders, the local government unit and offices of the Ministries of Health and Social Welfare, and even non-government organizations as partners. And then we replicated this model to respond to devastations brought by typhoons, such as Typhoon Haiyan and Washi, And in the COVID-19 pandemic, we eventually adopted this model to provide psychospiritual care to individuals and communities affected. So this included us providing care packages, informational materials. We did several video posts on social media on how they could cope during this pandemic, and virtual psychosocial support to individuals through their religious communities using virtual platforms. We have worked with several churches in coming up with a program, a hotline of some sort, which community members can call for support. Personally, I was involved by our archdiocese in its radio program, wherein I talk about mental health and talk about how religious and the lay can help each other and support other people. This started as just one guesting, which eventually they asked me to do it as a monthly thing, just really to promote both spiritual and mental health care during this time. And then I know we only have a few minutes, so let me go to my recommendations. We have seen in our work the value of multi-stakeholder partnerships in providing psychospiritual care during crisis. Since our work was with religious communities and leaders, NGOs, diplomats, international organizations like the WHO. We had partnerships with UNICEF back then, and several private organizations through their corporate social responsibility programs. So these partnerships eventually allowed us to reach many individuals, and partnerships with religious communities can help governments, international organizations, and NGOs reach those communities in need and assess their specific needs, because our religious communities are already embedded within their community. And religious leaders are also important links towards public health policies, programs, and interventions, since these leaders already have that special bond and trust that they have with their communities, which gives a unique access to this population. And of course, religious leaders and actors can also contribute on public health, especially on health behaviors. So we can strengthen this by providing support, training, and capacity building to religious leaders, since a lot of them, of course, are very adept in terms of providing spiritual care, but we can always bridge spiritual and mental health care together, especially if we empower and enable our religious leaders to do the same. So I think that's my answer to that question. I'm sorry if I went beyond a bit of time, but thank you so much.
That was actually just perfect. Thank you. So it's true, the work is just too much. It's not possible for it just to be religious leaders or just government or just this group or just that group. We have to form partnerships and spread out the work and collaborate. And when we do that, it also builds unity. We learn to serve. When we serve together, we form relationships. And when those bonds happen, when those bonds are created, we become more effective as well. I'm so encouraged by the work that's happening in the Philippines. I wish we could just duplicate it all over the world. And then seems like we might coming right. So friends, we have a bit of time now for just a few questions. There was one question, one thing actually was more of a comment, but I keep hearing this over and over again. And there was a comment about including spiritual health as a specific thematic intervention in the World Health Organization. I think that's exactly what they're realizing is necessary, and that's why we're here today, which is wonderful. So as we as people of faith come together across the world, if we can explore a little bit more about how to create, when we create balance in a human being, we address their spiritual needs, their social needs, their health, their mental health needs, and their physical needs. So I think maybe we could just explore that a little bit more. I know that Dr. Giles, you did speak to that a little bit already. I don't know if perhaps you'd like to speak on that a little bit.
Well, I'll actually pass and pass on the question and open it up to some of my other panelists and to see if they have some comments about that.
Okay. I know, Swami, you also mentioned it. Anybody would like to just share a little bit more about what does that mean to create that balance, and what are some steps we can take to help create it?
Maybe I could add one point. I think one of the challenges that I have discussed with my colleagues and other chaplains, and even at the health services on campus, is this kind of a fuzzy line dividing mental care and spiritual care, that when someone comes in need of help, how do we determine whether that person is having a psychological crisis, whether it's a mental issue or it's a spiritual issue? Sometimes people think it's a spiritual problem, but it's actually something just dealing with the mind. And so I think a clearer definition of what spiritual care would be, it won't be easy to find that, because it so much depends on the concept of spirit. And the concept of spirit, the idea of spirit, as it is understood across faith traditions, is understood in different ways. So to find an acceptable definition of spiritual care would be a challenge in itself, I think.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I know in the US, there's a lot of focus now on health and wellness. And I think part of that reason is that we have actually divided up spirituality and mental health into separate categories. It's always been this way from the time of Freud, who kind of led us along that path. And so each of those areas or professional areas work in kind of silos, separate silos. And if the pandemic and what we've seen in terms of the kind of violence in this country and, anti-Black, anti-Asian, and all those things that have happened, hatred and the rise of the acute mental health challenges that we have now, if that's not enough information for us to really understand that we are interdependent and really need to work together. Your comment, Haley, made a lot of sense to me in terms of working together and how working together, that those relationships build trust and support and allow us to actually have more of an influence in the communities where we are. So, yeah.
Thanks, Prof. Okay, there was an interesting question that came in. Can the presenters identify the greatest dilemma that arose from COVID, especially as it relates to the care of dying and those who have died? Would anybody like to speak to that? While you're getting your thoughts together,
I can start again, I guess.
Thank you, Dr.
That's
Renz.
okay. Yeah. One thing that we have encountered, particularly from those caring for the dying, is actually the dilemma of not being able to care for the dying. Because of this pandemic, those who are severely sick, or basically those who are infected, are already isolated from their families and their loved ones. So instead of having, their family members, their loved ones care for them, they're often left to talking to their family members via tablets or gadgets. And in some communities, in rural areas and in rural hospitals, for example, here in the Philippines, they don't even have internet connection, so that prevents them even from being able to speak to their families. So that dilemma is that they're not actually able to care for their families. On a spiritual side, usually, like for us Catholics, when you're sick, you usually get certain sacraments in order to guide you through the process, which are also not being provided during this time, because the priest will not be able to enter hospitals, and again, challenges doing this virtually make it also difficult for them. And then on the side of those who have died, grieving is also another case. Because in the past, you will be able to at least bring home the body with you, have some days, times to grieve with the deceased. But now, in the Philippines, at least, we directly have to cremate them. So there's no opportunity for them to at least give a final hug or goodbye to their family members. It's only the ashes that get to their home. So the grieving process becomes more complicated. It's like there's that feeling of losing someone without having that opportunity to actually say goodbye to them. So in terms of dilemma, I think it's something that we need to address, and something that we also need to find a way on how we can bring towards that care, both spiritual, physical, or even mental, especially to those who have been severely afflicted by COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Renz. I think related to what you've said and related to the challenges around that, going back to this lost and found concept, there was a comment from Sweetness, and she was saying, she's thinking of like, how can we use that as well? With the lost and found, this is about what's lost through sickness, what's lost through loved ones dying. There's so much different things that can incorporate. So I think that there was a question of how can we get some of those resources, perhaps, for example, in Syria, there was another question like, how can we help the friends in Syria? So perhaps we can share some of these resources that seem to be working with some of the workshops that have already taken place to help people process as well. If possible, maybe in the chat, you can leave your email and we can try and connect you, Sweetness, to some of those resources. But I think also the World Health Organization on their YouTube channel can make some of those things available, if I'm not mistaken. So I just wanted to mention those two comments. And dear friends, we are almost out of time. We have about 9 minutes left. Are there any other final thoughts that anybody would like to share before we talk about some of the recommendations?
Can I answer the question that is to me? There's a question to me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a question about what is needed from international organization to find some relief of the real situation you mentioned in regarding the spiritual resources in mental health in Syria, right? So I want to answer this question, and I'll be very transparent. Actually, I had a lot of activities in research and spiritual and religious. However, I was not able to reveal that because of fear of labeling. And only because this conference was by WHO, I was able to advertise about my participating in such things. So I think the first thing to do by INGO is to realize that there is a problem. This is the first step, is realizing there's a big problem, especially in our context when it comes to deal with these issues. So after we realize that there is a problem, then comes the need assessment, assessing this problem by participatory efforts with all stakeholders to see, how can we proceed? And then we can start with a few small steps, pilot steps. And I want to emphasize, engaging faith is very positive, but also you will have challenges. But you will not be able to solve these challenges unless we start to experience it. So if we are not experienced in the first place, how can we solve it? So I hope that all UN agency and INGOs take this note that there's a problem and it is like silent. I mean, people don't talk about that, but it is there under service. So I hope that some of the organization will initiate any initiative for just discussing about this. And this will be the first step in solving this problem. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. And lastly, and we're just about out of time, there was a question from David in Nigeria about how can we get a bit more clear differentiation between spiritual care and religious care. And just quickly from an interfaith perspective, from Religions for Peace, we have these core spiritual values that you will find in all religions. And if we, as people of faith, learn to draw on our higher nature, we will find the commonality. And in that commonality, we can then serve together. We can share resources together. We can train up each other. We can, connect the dots. So I think that that's going to be quite key in finding our way forward. I'd like to just ask if any of the presenters would like to share one or two final thoughts. We have 5 more minutes and then we're going to close the session. All right. So thank you all so much for your insights, your wisdoms. And I think that, again, this is the beginning of a conversation. This is just to get us excited because there's so much work to do and to do together. We're very excited that the World Health Organization is now partnering with people of faith, of all faiths, to figure out how we can work as collaborators in this great journey against this illness that has taken over the world. Or shouldn't take it. We're going to take over the world. We're going to get rid of the illness by working together, I should say, perhaps. So it is a journey. And we know that with any journey, there's going to be boulders and rocks in the way and things we need to get past. But I think as people of faith, we recognize that each challenge that comes is a gift because it has a lesson to teach us. So we must just approach everything with curiosity and an open heart and a willingness to work together, and we will make our way through this crisis. So thank you again, everyone, for being with us. All of our presenters, we are so honored that you're with us today. I'd like to just now hand over to Sarah Hess from the World Health Organization. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Haley, and thank you so much for moderating this session. I've really enjoyed listening to everybody's contributions and also to the suggestions of how we can build from this discussion into something more concrete. And at least, you know, from my perspective at the WHO, it's really our sincere wish that these conversations are a start of something and not just a conversation on a select day. So we really value the opportunity to be with you all here today. We'd like to just thank all our presenters for sharing their thoughts and their wisdom, and also the incredible work that they're doing in very diverse places in the world. So thank you for that. And just a reminder to all of those who are listening, we will take a 30-minute break now, and then we will be continuing with our fourth session in this series. And this is looking at the social care consequences and responses to closing places of worship. So another exciting panel. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And I really wish you a safe and healthy day.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, Dr. Mukunda Das, and hi, Wellington, and hi, Chris. Just going to wait a few more minutes for people to join. We're still live streaming, but we'll wait a few minutes before we start. Good to see you.
Olá, buenos dias. Eu vou hablar em espanhol, ok? E aí vai haver uma tradução.
Let's run to, oh my goodness. Yes, from Spanish to English. I can type.
Okay.
Hi, my audio is okay?
Yes, we can hear you clear. Thank you.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
I can hear you.
Thank you.
Chris, your audio is okay as well?
Good. Welcome, Chris, Dr. Das, Wellington.
Thanks. Good afternoon to everybody. I don't know if my audio is good, but I'm experiencing a challenge with internet connection. I hope it will not disrupt my connection. But for the moment, I don't know if it is okay.
We hear you well at the moment.
Hi, Sarah, this is Savaraj. Can anyone hear or see me?
We can. Welcome.
Yeah, wonderful to see you.
Hi, apologies, I haven't been in touch before. I know I just exchanged a few emails.
Well, hopefully this is the start of many conversations. So welcome today.
Thank you.
We are live, so our participants can hear us, which is not a problem at all, but just so that you're aware.
Good afternoon to all who are on the call.
Good afternoon, Savaraj.
I believe we're just waiting for 2 more panelists as well.
Mm-hmm. I see Raymond has joined us. Hello, Raymond.
Hello there, how are you doing?
Hi, Raymond, welcome.
Welcome. Just to let you know, we're live and we're just waiting for 1 or 2 more folks to join, and then we'll start the session.
Good. Do we have any idea how many people are out there?
I think there are approximately 50, if I can see right, but there's more on YouTube, so.
Sally, can I suggest something?
Sure, go ahead.
That we all have the chat open so that if there's something you want to share with us as panelists, we can see it in the chat room.
Sure.
Because I think only we can see the chat, the participants can't, is that right?
Raymond, everybody can see the chat, but if you select in the toolbar, hosts and panelists, then you can send a direct message only to the hosts and panelists.
Cool. So that'd be a good way in case Sally wants to pass any message on to us without the panelists knowing.
Thank you.
I mean, a nice message.
Only nice messages.
Thanks.
And we will also collect the questions that are coming in the Q&A.
Cool.
So we can...
Hi, Sally, logged in.
Hi, Vinu, wonderful to have you.
Same here.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, Vinu, welcome. Thank you for joining. We're about to start. We're live, but we're just waiting for everybody to get set up, including the interpreters. So welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The sound's okay, right? Just to double check the sound. The sound audio is okay, right? Thank you. Thank you.
A very warm welcome to everybody. What a pleasure it is to be able to spend an afternoon with you all. We don't get this opportunity often, so it's really wonderful. I've been watching my clock and waiting till it turns past, and we're ready to start. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Alexandra McFedrin, who's been one of the core team at WHO organizing this conference, to give some opening remarks. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. It took me a moment to unmute, so that won't be the first time today. Welcome everyone to this session. This is the fourth session in this track of spiritual care during times of crisis. As you may be aware, this is a part of a larger conference co-hosted between WHO and Religions for Peace, and we'll be sharing information about the conference in general in the chat box for you to know. But we're very excited today to have such an amazing, diverse group of panelists and to learn from you and with you. As you may be aware, this is live streamed to YouTube, so it's available, the recording's available now and will be available to you afterwards. There's no slides in this session, but for other sessions, if you registered, you will receive those afterwards. One really key point to get started is that we're very lucky today to have Wellington joining us from Brazil. So we'll have translation from Spanish, which means everyone needs to choose their language at the bottom bar. It should say interpretation, the bottom bar, and even if you can hear me now, make sure you click English. Right now it might be on default, so choose English so that when we get into translation, you will be able to hear the remarks from Wellington. Second, that just want to say that we are honored to be co-hosting with Religions for Peace, and I'll pass it to Deepika Singh shortly, who's the Associate General Secretary for Religions for Peace, or Secretary General, my apologies. And we really hope to learn a lot today from everyone. And this is one piece of a larger part of our work. So we hope to continue this conversation after today as well. So pass it to Deepika and then on to the moderators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Warm greetings to all. On behalf of Religions for Peace, I join Sarah and Alex in welcoming you all, and Sally, of course, to welcoming you all to this day 2 of our global conference, Strengthening National Responses to Health Emergencies, which we are so honored to have co-organized with WHO. First of all, allow me to request that we observe a moment of silence for all the lives that have been lost and for all those who have been and are still continuing to be affected by COVID-19. A moment of silence, please. Thank you very much. You know, the pandemic has sort of really truly reinforced the need for all sectors of societies to work together to mount an effective response to health emergency. And that is why we're so, this collaboration between WHO and Religions for Peace is so important. We truly laud WHO for reaching out to religious institutions, leaders, and faith-based organizations. You know, for the past 5 decades, Religions for Peace has been bringing together diverse religious institutions and faith leaders and communities to work together to address common concerns and challenges, including health issues, whether it be HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and now COVID-19. As you know, religious institutions and faith leaders have played a critical role in responding to COVID-19. Their ability to reach large numbers of people, their credibility and the trust that has been given to them by the people, their access to networks that reach from the grassroots to the international level. There are many resources, including dedicated volunteers, all make them a formidable player in addressing health crisis. And when they come together to work collaboratively, collectively through multi-religious collaboration, they can have even greater reach and impact. We have seen this, for example, in Mozambique, how just 250 religious leaders, women of faith and youth from different religions were able to reach out to nearly 25 million people through airwaves and the pulpits with health and safety guidelines within a very, very short period of time. In Peru, our interreligious councils is utilizing existing religious infrastructure such as the soup kitchen and places of worship as distribution centers to provide food, hygiene packs, and other needed supplies. So in this way, during the height of the pandemic, churches, mosques, temples, synagogues, gurdwaras, and other places of worship may have been closed for congregation to gather. However, the religious leaders, institutions, and communities continued to provide care and support, offer virtual prayer sessions, online spiritual counseling, and even utilizing the houses of worship as vaccination centers. This is just a very tip of the iceberg. So we are very honored that we have excellent panelists here with us today who will share their practical experiences and how other challenges and past learnings have guided their current responses. Thank you all for joining us. And now I hand it over to our moderators for this session, Sally and Chris. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Deepika. And Chris is going to just run through our list of panelists for this afternoon and introduce each one of them. So over to you, Chris. If your internet is up to it, please go ahead. Can you hear us, Chris? No. Okay. In that case, I'll step in and I'll introduce myself. My name is Sally Smith, and I'm a senior advisor with WHO, working to support the faith engagement in the COVID response and emergencies. And I've been working with Sarah, Alex, and the team to pull this conference together. My background is working with UNAIDS for many years in faith engagement in the HIV response, and it's a pleasure and a joy to be with you all today. So I'm joined by Savaraj Dillon, who is the director of the Guru Maneo Garas Gurdwara in the UK, by Raymond Perrier, who is the director of the Dennis Hurley Centre in South Africa, by Dr. Mukunda Mahadav Das, who is the vice president of the International Society for Krishna's Consciousness, by Dr. Vinu Aram, who is both a pediatrician and the president of Shanti Ashram and co-moderator of Religions for Peace in India, and Wellington Perrier, who is the coordinator of the Pastoral Human Rights of the Methodist Church of Brazil, Director of Advocacy and Institutional Relations for World Vision, and Vice President of the Brazilian Evangelical Christian Alliance. So welcome to each of you. I just want to outline for our participants what this particular session is about. This session has shifted the focus a little bit. This track has been looking at chaplaincy and the provision of spiritual care. We started off with a narrow focus, if you like, on chaplaincy as a profession in providing spiritual care, sometimes in hospitals, but also in universities and schools, in prisons and other places. We then moved on to look at the second session, we looked at the provision of spiritual care alongside palliative care, particularly important in this pandemic, with many people in hospitals in intensive care units needing both spiritual and intensive care. The third session this morning then looked at the intersection of spiritual care and mental health care, and how there are both many links as well as some diversity. And then this fourth session is looking at, as Deepika has just said, how when the houses of worship were closed during the pandemic, many faith communities found different and innovative ways of meeting social care needs within their communities. So you can see that this fourth session is part of a trajectory where we started from a very narrow focus and we're moving outwards. And so we do look forward to these presentations by our panelists, who will look at particularly how they have fed the hungry, provided medical care, protected the vulnerable, provided practical support to enable bereaved families and their loved ones to give their loved ones a dignified funeral, and built on previous initiatives to build resilience and to respond to other diseases such as HIV. So with that brief introduction, I'd just like to check if we can hear Chris, and if not, then I'll continue to moderate. Chris, are you with us? Oh, I'm sorry about that. Okay, we'll check again a bit later. So with that, I'd like to then introduce Savaraj Dillon, the director of the Guru Maneo Ganrath Gurdwara in UK, and ask you, Savaraj, could you tell us a bit more about your work providing food for local communities in need and for the key workers in the UK during the first wave of the pandemic, as well as some of the lessons that you learned from that work as you've moved into this second year? Over to you, Savaraj.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks to all the organisers and all the hard work that's gone on to kind of set up this session today. So I'm one of the trustees at the Guru Maneo Granth Gurdwara in the UK. Actually, one of the UK's largest Sikh temples. We're just located just outside London. Now, like everybody else, at the start of 2020, we had no idea what was in store for us and the challenges that the pandemic would present. However, what we did have with us was a teaching that was given to the world 550 years ago by Sri Guru Nanak Dev Ji, the founder of the Sikh religion. And that teaching was to see all of humanity as equal, whether you're male, female, king or servant. But for us, God dwells in all of us. That teaching was also to serve humanity unconditionally. Now, these teachings underpin the concept of langar, which you may be familiar with. So regardless of your faith, you can have a free meal at any Sikh Gurdwara around the world. And Sikhs have been providing this service for over 500 years. So in one respect, serving food to the needy was nothing new to us. It was part of our DNA, part of our history, I would say. However, for me and many of my generation, this was our first real test of commitment to service. So pre-COVID, we would volunteer at the Gurdwara, serving food, washing dishes. That required us to sacrifice time, but we didn't really face any risks or challenges that the pandemic would present. Now, at this time, I almost see it as entering a time of war. Would we still serve unconditionally and without discrimination as taught? That was the challenge the pandemic presented us. So how did we respond? Now, once lockdown was announced in the UK and the Gurdwara was closed to the public, we shifted our food service from being an on-site service to a delivery service for those who are isolating, those who are vulnerable. And it was just so great to see all our volunteers wanted to be involved. They wanted to prepare food, take calls, make deliveries. And as trustees, we all agreed that at this time of crisis, all our resources that were available, be it financial, people, buildings, they'd all be dedicated to ensuring that anyone who needed help would receive help. We just couldn't have our huge kitchens and pools of volunteers sitting at home, not working, not employed to help those who are struggling. So our operation grew rapidly from something that was supposed to be just a local delivery service to a huge distribution center. We collaborated with over 100 charities, served over 1 million hot meals, and distributed 400 tons of fresh produce to the needy and key workers, all of which was recognized in numerous awards, etc. But it wasn't about awards or recognition. We were able to translate the skills that we had in running one of the UK's largest temples into running a full-scale food program that made a difference to the lives of millions. We also offered our buildings to the NHS. Unfortunately, they weren't required. But what made all of this possible? It wasn't just that we were skilled in running large operations. I think what was really key for us was our unity and our humility as a team. Now, for us and many faith groups, we achieved that through, people say, praying together. For us, that's meditating together. Our meditation is called Simran. In the same way we serve humanity, we serve food, we serve God through Simran, through our meditation. Now, that unity and humility has been the secret to us kind of being able to serve unconditionally despite any risks or challenges that are out there. Now, I actually work in an investment bank during the day, and I volunteer for our charity. And what's really clear is in all our leadership training, building unity and humility in teams is the secret to success. Now, as threat from the pandemic starts to reside, our work in the community has opened our eyes up to a new threat. It's a threat that's kind of really spread, maybe partly down to lockdown and some of the other measures introduced during the pandemic. And that's the threat and the new danger from abuse and exploitation, be it domestic, sexual and criminal exploitation. And most of those victims are children. Now, what we've done in response is we've set up a new agency called Rekindle UK to educate and protect families from these new growing threats that we've seen kind of blossom or come out of the pandemic. So just sharing some of the experiences we have, and I'm so glad we were able to rise to that challenge, and those teachings that have been ingrained in us through our forefathers and our practices, we were able to kind of continue with those through this very challenging time. Thanks, Sarah. I'll hand back to yourself, Sally, sorry.
Thanks very much, Savaraj. That's just a wonderful encapsulation of the linkage between faith and service, and how a community is able to come together and build on those traditions of faith and service in such a crisis. Thank you so much. We'll now move on to Raymond Perrier, Director of the Dennis Hurley Centre in South Africa. And the question we have for you, Raymond, is can you tell us a bit more about your interfaith work in South Africa, providing shelter and support services for refugees and homeless people, and how you've been providing medical care for some of the other conditions that have been neglected during the COVID emergency? Thanks very much, and over to you, Raymond.
Thanks very much, Sally. What's unusual about Durban is that which is the city I'm in South Africa on the Indian Ocean, is that it's a city where different faiths have grown up side by side. So not a Muslim city that Christians came to or a Christian city that Muslims came to. In fact, we have thriving Christian, Muslim, and Hindu populations here, as well as much smaller Jewish and Buddhist populations. So the Dennis Hurley Centre is a very good example of that. We are a large building in the middle of the city, literally with the Catholic Cathedral on one side and the largest mosque on the other. And indeed, Mahatma Gandhi's law office, when he was a young lawyer, is right opposite us. So we're a place where the faiths of Durban have lived and worked side by side for 150 years. And the centre was set up as a place where people of all faiths can work together to help those most in need, principally homeless people and refugees in the centre of the city. So therefore, the impact of COVID has really put us to the test, and I think really shown how effective we can be as a network, a partnership of faith communities working side by side, both in this building and from this building in other parts of the city. That was very clear when we had a very hard lockdown. South Africa went from almost no response to COVID to a complete lockdown, which in the end lasted almost 4 months from March to June of 2020. And people were not allowed to leave their homes other than for food or medical care. Obviously, that raised an important problem. What happens to homeless people who have no homes in which to be locked down? And we worked with the municipal level of government here in Durban to create emergency shelters for the homeless. The municipality did most of the work in terms of the logistics and setting up the shelters. But what was phenomenal was the work of the faith communities in providing food in those places. Literally at one stage, we had Christians providing breakfast, Muslims providing lunch, Hindus providing dinner, and the Jewish community were providing food to all the people working across the different sites. So a really good example of collaboration. And tied in with that, we had a network of chaplains from all the different faith communities who were deployed to the different emergency shelters to help people with pastoral and spiritual care during that period. Obviously, we're no longer in a hard lockdown, and a lot of those services have continued. So we still have good collaboration between the faith communities in providing food. One of the things that we've seen is that a lot of the traditional feeding schemes for the homeless were run by churches and generally with older volunteers. For obvious reasons, those older volunteers have been reluctant to be out of their homes more than they need to be, but still are keen to provide food. And so we've arranged a system whereby people can prepare food in their homes, and that food is then collected and brought down here to the Dennis Hurley Centre and then distributed from here to people in need. So a way of connecting those who want to help with those who need help. And another interesting aspect of our work is healthcare. We provide a primary healthcare clinic for people on the streets. Again, it's a healthcare clinic which draws on support from all the religious communities, and recognizes that when dealing with an issue like healthcare, we need to understand the spiritual background of the people that we're trying to serve. That's been a big issue we've noticed with the vaccine program and the rollout of the COVID vaccine, where people might have religious anxieties or religious concerns about the vaccine. So we've been working with pastors and priests from the different Christian traditions and leaders of other faith communities to reassure people about the vaccine, to make sure that their anxieties and their concerns are addressed, and then working with the Department of Health to deliver those vaccines, because the links that we as a faith-based community have with the homeless and the refugees means they're much more likely to trust us and much more likely to come here to get their vaccines than going to government health departments, where they might be anxious about how they're treated or how their information will be used. So that's another very practical example in which the presence and the ethos of the faith communities works to the benefit of those affected by COVID.
Thanks very much, Raymond. Really, you've given us there a real flavour of that intersection of interfaith work, interdisciplinary work, and how you've brought together both volunteers and those in need. So just a really rich presentation there. Thank you very much. Just to check, is Chris back with us yet? So our next presenter is Dr. Mukunda Mahavdas, who's the Vice President of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Dr. Das, can you tell us something about the ways that you have reached out to support some of the migrant workers from rural areas? We were discussing on our call last week how you've been providing medical care and treatment, helping bereaved families to give their loved ones a dignified cremation ceremony, particularly during the very severe wave of COVID in India. Over to you, Dr. Das.
Thank you. We at International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, they're focused on 3 areas. One is free food distribution, other one is medical assistance, and then funeral assistance. Out of this, our core service area was free food distribution. In fact, our founder Acharya, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada of International Society for Krishna Consciousness instructed us, no one should go hungry. So that is the message of compassion for all those who are hungry. During the COVID lockdown, especially in metropolitan cities, we have seen in India so many migrant workers. In India, especially from the rural area, the villagers come to the city to work. So when the lockdown happens, they went jobless, and they wanted to even go back to their villages, but they were undergoing a lot of troubles, even to satisfy their hunger. So we stepped in, and the message of no one should go hungry, we took it forward, and we have prepared food and we have supplied food. And also the daily wage workers in metropolitan cities, they went jobless and they were also hungry, and also the poor and needy in all these places. So we have converted our temple kitchen into cooking meals and serving them all. And where there is much more need, we have even set up a special kitchen, bigger kitchen, a temporary kitchen was set up, and we were supplying free food for all those needy migrant workers, daily wage workers, and poor and needy. And one interesting thing about it is not only that the poor people needed food, even the rich and wealthy, they needed food. During the second wave in India, the effect was so high that in several families in the cities, the entire family, they became COVID positive and quarantined. They cannot leave their home. Even though they are wealthy, they cannot leave their home and they were not getting enough necessary things. So what we did in an innovative way is that we actually prepared food and we packed it nicely and we home delivered. We home delivered to all these home quarantined COVID positive patients, and during their entire time of their quarantine. So that was an important thing which we did, and many of them, they appreciated. So during this entire pandemic lockdown, we have throughout India, through all our centers, ISKCON centers in India, we have actually supplied 70 million meals. I repeat, 70 million meals all over India we have supplied, and that was our core service area, supplying meal to the pandemic affected people. And another area we did is the medical assistance, especially during the second wave. At the peak of it, the poor people were not even able to find a facility for their care, including no oxygen concentrator and things like that. So in cities, we have set up a special care facility. And also in rural areas, it was so difficult for the rural Indians to get some medical assistance. We have set up quarantine centers and oxygen facility, the beds with oxygen facility, all these things in our rural centers also. So in that way, we also did the medical assistance. And third area is funeral assistance. During the second wave peak of it, you must have seen in the news, the dead bodies were floating in the river Ganges, and the bodies were buried in the shallow pits of the river bed. This is all because in India, the tradition is that the dead bodies are cremated with wood. And there were no wood, scarcity of wood, so much death, there were no wood, and because of which they were disposing the body in the river as well as they were burying in the shallow pits. So during that time, we stepped in and we actually arranged wood for dignified funeral. The person is already a victim of COVID and he has passed away, and in a dignified way, a farewell is the person deserved. So we stepped in and we actually supplied free of cost the wood for dignified funeral. So in this way, ISKCON was involved in these three areas of supplying free food and also medical assistance and also funeral assistance. Over to you, Sally.
Dr. Das, thank you very much for your intervention. It's interesting, isn't it, as we listen to our speakers today, how there are some common threads about the importance of spiritual care and then that practical reaching out to communities who are hungry, to provide food for the hungry, to provide medical care for the sick, and to pray and to provide spiritual care, but also to make sure that those who've died and their families can have a dignified funeral, which is so important to people who have lost a loved one, both spiritually, but also mentally and emotionally. So thank you very much. Each of the speakers have referred to these different things in different ways. And it's important to see how these are weaving through as threads in this session. Thank you. I'd like to move on now to Dr. Vinu Aram, both a pediatrician and the president of the Shanti Ashram and co-moderator for Religions for Peace in India. Dr. Vinu, can you tell us a bit more about how you've transferred some of the learning from your experience over many years of working on the HIV pandemic, particularly your work with children, to the COVID pandemic? And have you been able to see some transferable lessons? And maybe there are other things that are quite unique. So Dr. Vinu, over to you.
Thanks so much, Sally. I want to reiterate what Dr. Mukunda Das has just shared about these different forms of seva or service that Mr. Dillon has also shared. During the second wave, we saw how important it was as part of the prescription of care to be able to get these warm meals. So I just want to thank my colleagues of bringing forth this very important phase of the service. Sally, my mind runs back to March 8th of 2021, which is International Women's Day. And at Shanti Ashram, which is an ashram inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, we were honoring 100 women who were on the front lines during the pandemic, during the first wave and in the midst of the second wave. And one sharing stays in my mind, and that was by the women head of our network of people living with HIV and AIDS. In my reflection this evening, I'd like to share two things. One is the link with our work in HIV, but also the invisible face of the pandemic, which was really something that is now coming forward, which are children. 1.5 billion children were affected. But this particular colleague who was heading the network of people living with HIV/AIDS said, when India had its first lockdown on the eve of March 25th, 2020, when everything came to a standstill, which many of us have not seen before in our adult lives, what also came to a standstill were clinics, ongoing clinics that were providing very important assistance to people with chronic illness, including HIV and AIDS. And she said within 3 days, she realized that the ART supplies would not reach families living with HIV and AIDS. And in the very first 2 weeks, our work at Shanti Ashram and our initiative for HIV and AIDS, what we had to do was to get permission for our networks to be able to receive ART and home deliver, just like food was home delivered, to make sure that at least in the minimum, ART was home delivered. And this is the human side of the pandemic that I would like to speak about. We know today the pandemic is in the second calendar year, 200 countries, 234 million people, the invisible face. In India, we're just beginning to look at vaccination coverage, Sally, and yesterday's numbers that are coming out, even though massive drives of vaccination, we see as a nation that only 1/3, 30% of India's population have received both doses. So we're still very vulnerable, and the at-risk population deserves our attention and I think our ongoing investment as we go forward. Let me answer this question in 3 parts. At Shanti Ashram, for the last 20 years, we've been working with children living with HIV and AIDS. So some of the challenges that they faced was shared by people living with HIV AIDS, like disruption to ART, not being able to look at CD4 counts, their vulnerability with co-infections and comorbidities, which meant that they had to be prioritized. But the prioritization did not happen till the first lockdown was over fully, and we were able to see the full impact of it. So this reiterated one thing, is that we needed people to represent different sections of society so that both the at-risk approach but prioritization for services happen. So at Shanti Ashram, our priorities were very clear. Amongst the people at risk that we wanted to work for and work with were people living with HIV and AIDS. The second thing that I want to also reiterate is this cannot happen in isolation. This has to happen in a broader framework. And in the broader framework, I think we have something to learn from over 2.5 decades or 3 decades of work in the area of HIV and AIDS. For example, stigma and discrimination, not only during the second wave where our health system stretched, we had millions of families under home quarantine, but we also saw very high levels of stigma, Sally. It reminded me of the pandemic, that people under home quarantine were shunned. Food was dropped at the doorstep, people were not speaking. So I think how to deal with stigma, discrimination, and social isolation were things that we had confronted during the pandemic. And because we had done it not alone, but in an interfaith framework, we were very quickly able to retrieve that model and started working together. A practical thing would be when in the national capital, one particular religious community was cited as a hotspot, as an epidemic center. Very quickly, the interfaith movement and leaders from religious communities said, do not push it to one community, it's a shared problem. So again, I think this one area of stigma. Second is care and support. We learned so much during our work in the early years of the HIV/AIDS pandemic that care and support have to go together with awareness and partnership building. And I think during the pandemic, this has been very important. Also because there was such a huge epidemic of misinformation that we had to keep giving the right information, but also being able to in tandem provide care. And here another big asset of religious communities, which are healthcare institutions that have been at the service and have had practical experience in working together to address the HIV challenges, came into use, the entire care and support infrastructure. The third thing that also I think came into use was something that I feel very, very powerful. And that is when the world had lockdowns, national boundaries were closed, and you had institutions having to find new ways of working together. Faith communities were present at the local level. And so they became very important points of support. In this case, Sally, not only for people living with HIV and AIDS, but I think for vulnerable communities. And so if there are three things at Shanti Ashram that we took away, one was not to point fingers and to burden anyone with more responsibility for spreading the virus or the pandemic, but immediately responding collectively and looking at it as a shared problem. We had experience in creating awareness and advocacy with in partnership with the scientific community, but we also had tremendous experience in providing care and support. And the third thing, I think, is while Religions for Peace and faith communities were already working, the very first interfaith convening by Religions for Peace was in March of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, when only 500,000 people had tested positive. And we continue to do that for the second year now. And the final thing for me has been, Sally, that we have been able to kind of raise the invisible face of the pandemic, which is the case of children. And here I think the broader case of children, again, because not only do we have places of worship where we reiterate human dignity and the burden that vulnerable communities face, but also because we have practical experience in providing services. And when these disruptions happen at the local level, faith communities were a very, very vital link to providing these services in the midst of big lockdowns. Religions for Peace, as an example, at the global level, we're looking at an ongoing dialogue to see how issues like vaccine inequity can also be addressed. And I think we have a wonderful work that has come out from a year and a half of work, but also I think some of the recent dialogues we've had at Lindau between the world of diplomacy and the world of faith to see how that can be taken forward as well. So Sally, those are some of the things where I think we've benefited from our early collaborations and experience and transferred them in the midst of a pandemic to creating more holistic, but also more meaningful responses, both at the global and the local level. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vinu. Some very wise words there, and much reflection on a long past history. Thank you very much. I'm not going to summarize your points as they are very rich. We'll come to that at the end. We have one more speaker on our panel before we come to a time of question and answer. And may I remind you all, if you haven't selected your language on the bottom toolbar, please go to interpretation. And if you're an English speaker, select English. That's where you will hear the translator, as Wellington will speak in Spanish. I'm going to now introduce Wellington Perrier. And he is a pastor in the Methodist Church, a national coordinator of the pastoral and human rights work of the Methodist Church in Brazil, director of advocacy and institutional relations for World Vision, and vice president of the Brazilian Evangelical Christian Alliance. Wellington, welcome. And you've asked us a couple of questions that you'd like to reflect on. First of all, what were the challenges of mobilizing leaders from different churches and faiths so that they could put their differences aside and unite to help people in need? And building on that, what lessons did you learn with those leaders involved in that relief action? Over to you, Wellington. You just have 6.
Muchas gracias, Sally. Muchas gracias a todos los compañeros de la mesa. Gusto muito grande ouvir ustedes. Me solidarizo com os países que passaram por essa tragédia em ter com tanta gente morta aqui, assim como vimos aqui em Brasil. Então, estou muito solidário a meus colegas que antecederam e puderam partir de suas experiências. Bem, nós outros aqui em Brasil tivemos 600.000 mortes, então foi talvez o terceiro país com mais mortes no mundo. Então tivemos uma situação muito grave e a sociedade brasileira se involucrou na resposta a essa situação. Então, se nós outros, como uma organização cristiana, pensamos uma mobilização de liderazgo, pastores, pastoras e líderes em geral, para que eles, a partir de suas comunidades locais, puderam ajudar a gente que estava sofrendo. Eu vou expressar rapidamente uma experiência que tivemos na região da Amazônia do Brasil. que é na região mais aislada, onde está a floresta de Amazônia. Ali tivemos uma situação muito grave de falta de oxigênio. Então, foram miles de mortos em el dia, porque não os hospitais não tinham oxigênio para a gente que ia para os hospitais. Tivemos, por exemplo, aí em Manaus, cova coletiva. Eram tantos mortos que não havia cova para todos. Então, o serviço funerário teve que abrir uma grande sala e enterrar muita gente junta, porque não tinha capacidade de enterrar tantos mortos. É uma verdadeira tragédia. E lá a igreja foi muito importante nessa situação. Não somente a igreja cristiana, mas outras religiões. Nossa atuação foi mais forte com as igrejas. Então, o que nós outros fizemos? Trabalhamos com o liderazgo de maneira que puderam colocar suas diferenças de lado para ajudar a gente, porque a vida está em primeiro lugar. Então, os líderes aí compreendido que apesar das diferenças religiosas, que cada um acredita à sua maneira, que nós outros respeitamos, mas a vida estava em primeiro lugar. E desta forma, as igrejas abriram suas portas para poder receber a gente que estava enferma, a gente que saía do hospital, a gente que estava necessitando de comida, de conforto espiritual. Então, a igreja foi muito importante. Se não fosse a igreja e os líderes religiosos, nossa tragédia teria sido mais grande todavia. Então, de alguma maneira, a igreja foi muito importante para amenizar pouco mais o sofrimento da gente. Então, nós outros fizemos também uma mobilização para comprar oxigênio, paquetes de oxigênio para enviar para Manaus. Em uma semana, conseguimos, por meio de mobilização da igreja, comprar 1.000 cilindros de oxigênio para poder enviar para as zonas mais distantes, porque na região da Amazônia não há muitas carreteiras, porque é uma região de muitos rios e de muitas florestas. Então, o transporte mais comum em esta região são os barcos em rios, e é transporte demorado. Então, a igreja se uniu para enviar esse socorro à gente de oxigênio, de comida e também consolo espiritual, porque a gente estava muito desesperada, muito sem esperança. E aí chegou a igreja com a esperança para a gente e, graças a Deus, conseguimos superar este momento e agora tivemos muitas lições aprendidas. E aí, para finalizar, isto foi muito bueno porque alguns líderes de igrejas que nunca haviam se comunicado antes se sentaram na mesa para ajudar a gente. Eles sentaram por primeira vez e miraram que suas diferenças são muito pequenas em vista da necessidade das pessoas. E agora, esta gente segue trabalhando junto, cooperando a partir de sua realidade local. Então, nós outros queremos agradecer a oportunidade de religiões por a paz e também da Organização Mundial de Saúde, agradecer por poder partir pouco de nossa experiência em Brasil, especialmente na região de Amazônia. Graças, Sally, estou aqui à disposição.
Thank you so much, Wellington. It's a delight to have you with us, and we're so pleased that we've had our translators here today to enable us all to hear your interventions. Thank you so much. So much of what you have said has resonated with what other colleagues on the panel have said. Again, I'm not going to summarize your remarks right now, Wellington. Let's move into answering some of the questions that have come from our listeners. And then perhaps I can summarize at the end. So thank you once again. We do have a couple of questions that have come into the chat. And the first one is from Mary Tracy. Mary is curious to know if any of the obstacles you encountered during the community work surprised you. Was the humility and unity in your service? And were you able to address some of the unsurprising difficulties in new ways? Perhaps we're seeing as we've got Wellington on screen and we have the Spanish translators going. I'll start with Wellington, then I see Raymond you'd like to answer. So Wellington, over to you.
Sim, tivemos muitas dificuldades no início. Assim que a pessoa trabalha, a gente mirava com uma certa desconfiança para que era aquilo, principalmente porque estamos vivendo em Brasil uma sociedade muito dividida, e com muita intolerância. A gente está muito intolerante uns com os outros. Então, tudo que vai fazer, as pessoas há uma intolerância. Mas, em la medida que a gente mirou que o objetivo era ajudar a gente sem nenhuma pretensão elitista ou política, a gente abraçou a ideia. Sim, então, eu creio que o obstáculo tive, porque foi muito comum. Por outro lado, conseguimos vencer os obstáculos com gente clave, com liderazgo clave, que transmitiu sua mensagem também a outros líderes. Graças.
Thank you, Wellington. Again, that overwhelming sense of need was able to overcome some of the divisions that were there in the past. Thank you.
Sally, sorry, you want to unmute.
Oh, sorry. I was saying, Raymond, would you like to unmute? And would you like to respond to the question from Mary? We then have another question that I'll perhaps address to some of the other panelists so that we could have some diversity in the answers. So go ahead, Raymond.
Yes, and I think my comment ties in with that of Wellington. We saw a division here between leaders and the people on the ground. It's interesting how almost all religious faiths, with there are a few honorable exceptions, are quite hierarchical institutions. There is a person at the top, 9 times out of 10 a man, 99 times out of 10 a man, and then the people on the ground who do the work. I can see Dr. Vinu is nodding vigorously at this point. So at the beginning of the COVID outbreak in South Africa, I found myself attending 2 sets of meetings. I was at meetings which were very short and very focused by people who deliver services, talking about how do we make sure we continue to deliver services, how do we marshal resources, how do we marshal volunteers, how do we work with the rules that are in place to keep ourselves safe but still provide services. And then I was in meetings with religious leaders, and they were very long and they were very ponderous. And they were discussing, how do we keep our churches open? And can we still have water in the baptismal font? And will we still be able to have laying on of hands in order to bless people? And they were entirely inward looking about their religious rituals and their religious practices, and not at all outward looking. It was quite a shock. I'm pleased to say that the lay people, if you like, the people who are not priests, very much set the tone and set the pace, and the religious leaders caught up. And when they did caught up, they understood that that was really the focus of the religious communities and needed to be for as long as this took. But I was, I have to say, rather disappointed at how long it took them to catch up with the trend that was set.
Thanks, Raymond. Yeah, very very interesting observation. I think I see others around the panel nodding at that. Let's move on to our next question. This is from Chaplain David. We've heard how faith-based communities collaborated together to serve humanity during the pandemic. But how can chaplains pool their resources to serve people better in a multicultural and multi-religious society? I see Vinu, Dr. Vinu, you have your hand up there. Would you like to start by having a shot at that question? Thank you.
I'm very glad this question is asked, because I nodded vigorously when Raymond was speaking, because I think for me, this was a moment where we saw disconnect in the pre-COVID world of people who decided and people who executed. And during the lockdowns, we realized that everybody had to be sort of a decision maker, and everybody had to be an executor. So Raymond, I hope we have hit the refresh button in terms of more equality of decision making and leadership, and the frontline workers are a testimony that the principle of subsidiarity must be more central in the way that we function. Sally, in terms of, I think, how religious communities, I was amazed when in the beginning of the pandemic in India, one particular religious community was cornered. And knowing how sensitive it is when you corner people, they can become defensive, they can kind of withdraw and do. I thought that it was very mature in India for religious communities to come together to do three things. One was to have an ongoing dialogue with government. So there were times when religious leaders said, we are compliant with government procedures. We said it explicitly so that there was a moment of unity. And then there was a wonderful ongoing dialogue with the scientific community. I remember in the discussion that the chief scientist of WHO, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, had, and I was present, the two of us, along with the government of Tamil Nadu, and we brought in religious communities to say, how can the three verticals work together, which is religious communities, government and governance, as well as the scientific community. And this, I think, has not been an isolated experience. In many parts of the world, religious leaders have recognized what their role is. Their role is not to provide, not to find the scientific information, but to share the scientific information with their added trust and authority. And that was, I think, a very powerful way in mitigating, both at the global level, but also at the local level, the sort of the misinformation epidemic. And to the chaplain's particular answer, I think the reason why the local religious communities cooperated, and I say this affirmatively, I have seen it at Shanti Ashram. We have served 35,000 children in the 100 villages around. We have done it together because at a deeper level, there was a recognition that this was a big problem beyond any one community's capacity. So we have to work together. And at another level, I think this was really a moment of rediscovering humanity. How could you take warm meals and say this is only in a typical Indian village where 4 religious communities or 5 religious communities? How could you say I will give only warm meals for the Hindu community? So at a practical level, I think, again, reiterating what Mr. Dillon from the UK, from the Sikh community said, as well as Dr. Mukunda Das, at the local level, this was really to model the values we believed in. And modeling of values became very powerful when we did it together. So I think to every chaplain, to every priest, I would say, this is what speaks more effectively to our community, living our values rather than just speaking about our values. And I've had some very positive examples from India, but I know from across South Asia as well, Sally. So
thank you.
Come together.
Lovely. Some really important insights there. And again, I see people on the panel nodding. We just have a couple more questions that have come in. I'd like to give Dr. Das and Savaraj the chance to just respond to these perhaps before we close. So we have a question here from Gabrielle in Nigeria, who was saying, how were you able to deal with a long-standing fear of of partnerships where there's been distrust between different faith communities, and perhaps distrust between the faith community and the government in the past. I don't know if Dr. Das or Savaraj, you'd like to have a go at that one, or if not, then we can invite one of the others.
I can take that one.
Thank you, Savaraj.
What I think is, I think when things first started, I agree. I think people were probably thinking they were going to serve their own communities. I think as the size of the issue and the problems that we all faced together grew, I think it opened all of our eyes up. I think it started to destroy our own egos. That what we were facing was beyond any kind of one group or one religion. And I just think, I just think it's, for me, it was God showing us we are all one. We need to see everybody as one, and we need to work together. Now, one of the points we raised earlier on was, how do we continue like this? We've been through this, and I'm sure in history, people have come together at times of crisis. The key thing is now, how do we keep that unity? How do we keep that communication? Because during the crisis, we were getting calls, we were referring people to whoever had the expertise. We didn't think, twice about which religion they were from, which faith or background. But it's really important we don't crawl back into almost our shells, or our religious leaders don't start subtly encouraging that, and people again building their own empires and things. So I think that's something we've seen. I think it was destroyed for at least 6 months to a year. But I do fear we could end up going back there if we don't put some mechanisms in place, or forums like this where we could communicate regularly and make this more of a permanent way of working. It's just going to be a memory and a nice time otherwise.
May I say
really wise words there. Really wise words, Savaraj. Dr. Das, would you like to pick that up?
Yeah, in Mumbai, especially during the pandemic, in fact, there were so many migrant workers of different religion. You can't distinguish between which religion who belongs to. The government is so concerned that they wanted to actually provide free meals to them. And in fact, the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai, they approached us and they said that, can you please provide free food to them? And in fact, we cooked and we provided food to them. And there was a complete trust, and there is no distrust actually. And we worked together with the government, as well as we provided food to the needy, especially the migrant workers and the poor who were actually very hungry. And it was a wonderful experience, and there is no fear of distrust amongst us.
Thank you, Dr. Das. Very important. Very important. We have one last question, and it's quite an unusual one. Chaplain Joy is curious to know if you encountered any cultural shock, and how did you handle it? We just have about 2 minutes left, so maybe we'll just go around the panelists and give you a minute each to answer. Dr. Das, you're still on the screen. Would you like to just have your last word?
In fact, there is no really cultural shock. This was certainly a continuity of what we were actually doing before in a little different scale. So we were okay with definitely whatever service we were doing, and we were able to serve in a better way, and we did it well, and we are happy about it, and we would look forward for any other occasion to extend our own services.
Thank you, Dr. Das. Wonderful. I'm just going to go around the screen. Raymond, would you like to pick up next?
I think the biggest cultural shock I've seen has been in the most recent few months in the response to the COVID vaccine. So it hasn't been a difference between religions, but between groups within religious traditions. Some completely understanding that science and religion are partners, and that God has given us this vaccine, and we should use the vaccine because it is one of the ways in which God is enabling us to protect ourselves and each other. And then bizarrely, religious leaders who I thought were sensible, modern people, very oddly getting on a bandwagon of fake news about the vaccine, and that's very disappointing. And there's clearly a cultural antipathy there towards science, which I find very worrying.
Thank you, Raymond. Some very important comments there. Thank you. I'll just move on then to Dr. Vinu, a final comment around that one.
So I don't know if cultural shock is the word, but definitely positive discomfort will be how I would describe it, is the opening up of society to mental health issues and religious communities to speak about loneliness and social exclusion. And I find this something that opened up at a scale that we had not seen before. And the dialogue, I think, has been really high quality and at a higher level, involving many people. So I call it positive discomfort. And I hope in countries like India, we'll be able to make use of this window of opportunity to take forward a more comprehensive way of addressing health, including mental health. WHO says it's a year without a precedent. I hope after the pandemic, we will have a moment to say that this unprecedented epidemic of mental health illnesses led us to do better things for our community to ensure better mental well-being.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinu. And we have two more panelists. I'd just like to turn to you for your final comments on this or any final remarks. Savaraj, would you like to go next? You're on mute, Savaraj.
Sorry, it was just the only comment I probably have was I think there was a cultural fear spreading through society, and I think at times it wasn't helpful. People, so worried they wouldn't even kind of communicate with family, and we saw lots of breakup of family structures, etc., which we were going in to kind of support people with food, support, etc. So I think there's a balance of safety and fear, and sometimes the destroying of family networks and things through fear can have a more of a negative effect than some of the maybe scientific health kind of reasons from people isolating, so strictly. So I think there's something to learn there as well.
Thanks very much, Savaraj. And Wellington. Again,
gracias. Eu creio que lo más grande choque cultural que tuvimos aqui é que nuestro presidente de la República é negacionista. Então, ele não acreditava muito em la vacuna, em la doença, e ele ha trabalhado em contra de la população. Por exemplo, nós tivemos 600 pessoas mortas. Poderíamos ter um número muito mais baixo se o presidente tivesse uma outra atitude. Então, alguns líderes, e ele é sustentado muito fortemente por lideranças evangélicas. Então, tivemos que trabalhar com muitos liderazgos para poder falar para vacunar a gente, porque alguns líderes não queriam vacunar a gente porque falava que a vacuna poderia ser malo, seria algo malo. Então, tivemos todo trabalho com o liderazgo para convencer a gente que a vacunação era boa e era uma dádiva de Deus por a ciência ter descoberto uma vacuna tão rapidamente. Então, tivemos todo esse trabalho de convencimento dos líderes e para que pudesse convencer sua comunidade a se vacinar. Então, eu creio que o maior choque foi este. Graças.
Thank you, Wellington. So we're just a little over time. I hope you will just give us 2 more minutes grace as we close today. I'd like to recognize my colleague, Chris Kazadi Lupemba, who's the chairperson of the Interfaith Youth Network in the Democratic Republic of Congo and is representing Religions for Peace here as my co-moderator. I'm very sorry that your internet was not up to joining us today, but we've very much appreciated your help in helping us to shape and develop this session. So thank you. Just a couple of things to just pull the threads together, if you like. What has struck me through this track, but also through today's session, is that critical intersection of faith and spiritual care with practical care, meeting the needs of the hungry and those who don't have shelter, but focusing most of all on the vulnerable and the role of the faith community in reaching the vulnerable, the role of the faith community in bringing trust in science, in medical care, in vaccines, for example. The role of the faith community in working at partnerships with one another, but also partnerships with the state and the state provided services. I did notice one comment in the chat that most of the medical services are provided by the state. Yes, of course, that's the role of the state. But the faith community can bring some of those wraparound services, if you like, to oil the wheels and to reach the parts that perhaps are difficult to reach out in the Amazon jungle or in the slum dwellings or amongst communities that have a distrust of the government for some reason. And so I think that it's not either or, it's about building together those infrastructures that help us to reach the most vulnerable, and particularly children, the migrant workers, the hungry, the refugees. And it's been exciting through these 4 sessions to see very much how people have brought not only spiritual care, but also practical care. And they have been a lifeline to so many communities. So I want to thank those of you on the panel today, many of you who are listening on the chat and who are providing excellent services in your own communities. And to say that we're committed to continue these conversations, and we will be reaching out to expand our communities of practice. We'll be inviting you to join the communities of practice where we can shape how these discussions move forward. So thank you very much for your time today, and goodbye. Hand back over to Sarah.
No need, Sally, a wonderful summing up. So just thank you from me to everybody and to you for moderating so carefully. And it's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sally. Thanks, Deepika.
Thank you,
Sarah.
Deepika.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Wellington. Thank you for joining.